All right, let's talk about one of the biggest financial train wrecks of our lifetime, the 2008 global financial crisis. We're going to use the story from The Big Short to figure out how a tiny handful of people saw the whole thing coming when pretty much nobody else did.
I mean, it's the big question, isn't it? The entire world economy almost went off a cliff. Trillions of dollars just gone. And yet, a few guys in the corner were screaming that the sky was falling. So how did they know? Well, to get to the bottom of it, we have to start with the one thing everyone, and I mean everyone, thought was completely bulletproof.
And that's where we begin, with this so-called rock-solid foundation, the thing that was supposed to be the safest investment on the planet. That bedrock was something called a mortgage-backed security, or MBS. Now, on paper, the idea sounded pretty smart. You take thousands of different home mortgages, you bundle them all up, and you sell little pieces of that bundle as an investment. The thinking was, hey, even if a few people can't pay their mortgage, there are thousands of others in the pile. It's diversified. What could possibly go wrong?
And here's the absolute kicker. These things were considered unbelievably safe. So safe that the big rating agencies gave them a AAA rating. That's the highest you can get. Basically saying this is as safe as investing in the US government.
But not everyone was buying it. And this is where our story really starts, with a quirky hedge fund manager named Dr. Michael Burry. He decided to do something that was apparently completely revolutionary. He actually looked inside the box. And what did he find? Oh boy, it was a complete disaster waiting to happen. These safe bundles were stuffed full of junk. You had rising late payments, tons of loans given to people with terrible credit scores. These were the infamous subprime loans. And a lot of them were adjustable rate mortgages, which meant the payments were about to explode upwards.
You see, this was his secret weapon. He just didn't trust the shiny AAA label on the outside. So he went to the banks and made them give him the raw data on all the thousands of individual mortgages inside. He did the homework nobody else was doing and realized the foundation wasn't rock solid at all. It was basically quicksand.
Okay, so Burry knows the whole housing market is a giant bubble about to burst. But how do you bet against the American housing market? A tool for that didn't really exist. So what do? You get someone to build it for you.
He went to the big banks and convinced them to create something called a credit default swap. Now, don't let the name scare you. Just think of it like an insurance policy. Burry paid the banks a regular fee, a premium. And if those mortgage bonds started to fail, the banks had to pay him a massive amount of money.
But this was an absolutely insane gamble. He had to keep shelling out millions of dollars for these insurance premiums. And if he was right about the crash, but just a little too early with his timing, he'd run out of money paying the premiums before the whole thing collapsed. He'd lose everything.
Now, Burry wasn't alone for very long. Word of his crazy bet started to spread, and another group, led by a trader named Mark Baum, got interested. But they weren't just satisfied knowing what was happening. They wanted to know why. And their investigation, well, it uncovered something much, much uglier.
The best way to think about it is like a game of Jenga. The banks were building these mortgage bonds by stacking layers and layers of riskier and riskier loans at the bottom. The tower just kept getting taller and shakier, but because the blocks on top looked okay, everyone just assumed the whole thing was stable.
And then it got even worse. When the banks had a bunch of the riskiest, garbage-level mortgage bonds that nobody wanted to buy, what did they do? They bundled all that garbage together into a brand new product, a collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. The film has this great analogy where a chef takes all the old, unsold fish that's about to go bad and throws it into a seafood stew. They called it something new, and you're not going to believe this. The rating agencies stamped it AAA.
So how on earth could this happen? Simple. It was a perfect chain of zero accountability. The mortgage broker who signed someone up for a risky loan, he got his commission and sold the loan to a bank within days. The bank, they packaged it up and sold it just as fast. It was like a game of hot potato, and at every single step, the risk was passed on to the next person, until it ended up with investors who were told they were buying a super safe product.
So where were the referees in all this? The rating agencies? Well, it turns out they had a massive conflict of interest. The banks were their clients, paying them for the ratings. And as this quote from the movie lays bare, if one rating agency didn't give the banks the AAA ratings they wanted, the banks would just walk down the street to their competitor who would.
At this point, Mark Baum's team thinks they've seen it all. They've uncovered the whole fraud.
But then they discover the final, most terrifying part of this whole mess. The problem wasn't just some bad mortgages anymore. It was so much bigger. So let me ask you this. Take a guess. How much bigger do you think the market for betting on these bonds was compared to the actual value of all the real mortgages out there? Like twice as big? 5 times bigger, maybe? Try 20 times bigger. For every $1 of actual mortgages, there were $20 worth of side bets. The financial system had literally built a doomsday machine.
They did this with things called synthetic CDOs. Now, we're not even talking about real mortgages anymore. These were just bets on other bets. The movie explains it perfectly. Imagine a blackjack table. The player has a hand, but then you have 100 people standing around the table making massive bets with each other on whether that player is going to win or lose. That's what was happening. The risk was being multiplied into the stratosphere.
And so when homeowners started to default, the whole thing just crumbled. At first, the banks just pretended their toxic assets were fine. And then our heroes faced a whole new nightmare. What if the banks that owed them all that insurance money, like Bear Stearns, went bankrupt before they could pay up? And in the end, the only thing that prevented a complete and total meltdown of the global economy was a massive government bailout.
And that's maybe the most sobering part of this whole story. The system didn't correct itself. The very banks and institutions that caused the crisis were saved by taxpayer money.
Which leaves us with one final and pretty chilling question. Just a few years after the crash, in 2015, banks started selling a brand new product. They called it a bespoke tranche opportunity. As the movie points out, that's just a fancy new name for a CDO. So you have to ask yourself, did we really learn anything at all?